Welcome to today's webinar, Human Trafficking and the Child Welfare Population in Florida. My name is Susan Howley, and I am the Program Director for the Center for Victim Research. The Center is built through a partnership between researchers and practitioners at the Justice Research and Statistics Association, the National Center for Victims of Crime, and the Urban Institute. The Center's mission is to serve as a one-stop resource for victim service providers and researchers to connect and share knowledge to increase access to victim research and data and the utility of research and data collection to crime victim services nationwide. Today's webinar is designed to address both of those by sharing some recently gathered data and other evidence regarding child and youth trafficking and thinking about what that means for practitioners. The Center for Victim Research and this webinar are supported by funding from the Office for Victims of Crime at the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. And now it is my pleasure to welcome our presenters today, Deborah Gibbs from RTI International and Sue Aboul-hosn from the Florida Department of Children and Families. Ladies, welcome. And Deborah, I'm passing the slide control to you.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Well, Sue and I are both honored to be here. And in the spirit of the Center for Victim Research, what we're talking about today is an example of a research practice partnership in which the expertise of the Florida Department of Children and Families, who has absolutely been a terrific leader in this field, has informed what we do as researchers in the grant that is also funded by the National Institute for Justice. And we at RTI International have worked very hard to share what we're learning from this grant as we go along at each stage so it can inform practice at DCF and support DCF in communicating about the important research or important work that they're doing. So let me give you a quick overview to start with of what we'll be talking about. And Jason, I need a little technical assist in where
Deborah, if you look right at the top of the screen, you'll see a number 4. If you click on the arrow next to that.
Thank you for that reminder. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is a quick background on both where these numbers come from, the research and practice combination that provides the information that we're going to be talking about, a quick overview of federal and state policy that frames the role of child welfare in responding to human trafficking, both at the federal level, at the state level generally, and specifically at the state level in Florida. Then we're going to describe our analyses of Florida's data on children with human trafficking allegations, including their demographic characteristics, their child welfare experiences, with a specific look at the experiences of children who run from care and are at increased risk of trafficking victimization, and a more in-depth look at labor trafficking of children within the United States. And we're going to give this a little extra attention because it's something that is widely not addressed in the broader field of trafficking research. I want to talk quickly about what we know about the extent to which Florida trafficking generally is still not entirely identified, even in Florida, the state which is doing the most, or among those doing the most to identify and respond to trafficking. I'll probably say that again before the webinar is over. And based on what we have learned so far, both in our own research and that of others, where are the priorities for prevention services and other kinds of response? So going to the research and practice, what I'm going to be talking about, and Sue as well is a combination of three sources of information. First, we have a study that is ongoing, being conducted by RTI for the Administration for Children and Families, in which we're compiling information on how child welfare agencies nationally are working to train staff, identify victimization, and provide specialized services. The numbers and data that we present specifically relate to Florida come from our study that we've just wrapped up, in which RTI has worked closely with DCF to describe the characteristics and experiences of children who have been identified as potentially trafficked. In that study, we have used data for all children who have investigated allegations of any kind of child abuse, neglect, or child maltreatment between 2011 and 2017. That's over 1 million children, of whom just over 6,000 had investigated allegations of human trafficking. So that's an enormous data set, which, for people, researchers like me, just gets our heart going pitter-patter, but we always recognize the limitations of that data in terms of the many things that we'd like to know more about that aren't reflected in that data, and the remaining likelihood of under-identification of trafficking. And the third source of information that we're going to be drawing on today is Sue's experience as somebody who has coordinated response within central region of Florida and been very much involved in identification, investigation, and case management or overseeing cases related to children with trafficking allegations. So I know many of you are very familiar with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and I won't describe that except to say this is the landmark piece of legislation first enacted in 2000 and reauthorized several times, that defines sex and labor trafficking and specifically calls out trafficking or exchange of any sexual act of something of value as human trafficking, even if there's not force, fraud, and coercion involved, if the person involved is under the age of 18. So that's the first critical piece that really focuses attention on young victims of human trafficking. As we'll talk about later, that applies to sex trafficking, but not to labor trafficking. There's also two additional pieces of legislation passed in 2014 and 2015, the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act and the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. These defined sex trafficking as a form of child abuse and neglect, extended the mandate of child welfare agencies to responding to sex trafficking among children who are already among the population they're being served, and then more broadly, making trafficking of any child defined as maltreatment and within the purview of the state child welfare agency, even if the person, the adult involved, is not a parent or caregiver, even if the child is not trafficked by a third person. So it's a very broad mandate. Those two acts together create requirements for child welfare agencies to accept investigations, conduct prevention services, take special attention to children who run away from care, and report data. Finally, state safe harbor laws have been passed, some of them well ahead of the federal legislation, that provide levels of protection for minors, for children under the age of 18, so that they really decriminalize what used to be called juvenile prostitution, and in some states provide additional diversion from the justice system or even protection from prosecution for related crimes. Now, Florida was well ahead of the federal acts of 2014 and 2015 in their response. So Sue is going to give us a quick overview of how Florida's policy response has evolved.
Hello, this is Sue. Thank you, Deborah. First of all, I do want to say that we're very grateful that RTI chose Florida for their study and that we're also learning from the information that they have come up with. So we're really thankful for that. But I want to review a little bit of the Florida legislation that was specific to DCF, and those in social services know that we use a lot of acronyms. So DCF stands for the Department of Children and Families, so it's the State Child Welfare Agency here in Florida. So when I say DCF, that's what I'm referring to. But there was several legislative changes to our statutes that defines the protocol that we use now, and it also is what gave us all the reports that we have. So going back in 2006, it was ordered, through legislation that state agencies were to help victims of human trafficking and that DCF can become involved when a caregiver is not available. And when there is a victim of child trafficking, it definitely requires notification to law enforcement. So that was back in 2006. And the fact that DCF can become involved when a caregiver is not available led to the 2009 adding human trafficking as a maltreatment to our abuse index at the Child Abuse Hotline. Because with our maltreatment of human trafficking, it does not have to be a parent caregiver as the alleged perpetrator. It could be someone unknown, a third party, or even, the allegation could say the child is independently trafficking him or herself. We accept all of those reports. So that was a little bit unique from other states, I know that. So, and then in 2012, we had the Safe Harbor Bill passed. Again, everyone's kind of familiar with that, but it focused on making sure that commercially sexually exploited children were treated as victims and looked to as victims. It also asked for DCF to license safe houses for victims and for children who are victims of trafficking to be assessed for placement in a safe house that were victims of CSEC, commercially sexual exploitation, sex trafficking. And then 2014, we had another big bill passed, which said that we had to develop a screening or assessment tool. We had to have specialized, here it says CPI, and CPI stands for Child Protective Investigators, and case managers, CM standing for case managers, training. So when a CPI, a Child Protective Investigator, received a report on human trafficking to investigate, they had to have a specialized status to be able to respond to human trafficking. And then a case manager received a victim on their caseload, they had to have that same specialized status. So it was extended training from their regular training. In 2014, the statute also said that we had to have MDT staffings, which we already were having anyhow since 2009. That was part of our protocol. But it had to identify the services for the child and who had to participate in the staffings. Also, that DCF and DJJs, our Department of Juvenile Justice, had to also participate in task forces. And it created a statewide council on human trafficking, which had a few subcommittees, and one of them, the Social Services Subcommittee, was chaired by our Secretary of our Department of Children and Families. And then more recently, in 2017, Senate Bill 852 passed, which again sophisticated the whole MDT process again, and MDT stands for Multidisciplinary Team Staffing. And that staffing had to inform a case plan for all suspected and confirmed victims of trafficking. And it also requested for a 6-month follow-up on all verified CSEC victims. So as we go through as Deborah shared some more of the statistics that they came up with, we do know that 80% of our reports we receive at our hotline are on community children, not foster care children, at the time we received the report. So we still have to do a 6-month follow-up with all the community children as well that had a verified report. So quickly going over how our response protocol is designed, obviously the report is made to the abuse hotline. And back in 2009 when we added that maltreatment to our abuse hotline, it was human trafficking. So we accepted all reports of human trafficking. But we quickly learned that when we want to pull information, we don't know if it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking. So we divided it up later, within a few years, to subtypes of CSEC for sex trafficking and labor for labor trafficking. But once it comes to the hotline, it's assigned to a specialized CPI, and that CPI is immediately sends notifications to the people that are on that particular area's list. So mostly it's going to be the people that would be in the MDT. It would be law enforcement jurisdiction of wherever the intake was, to know that a report came in. And we do respond with law enforcement if they request us, to wait for them to respond. Depending on the situation, would be if they respond with law enforcement immediately or if they waited. We have a screening tool, which in 2014 we had to develop a screening tool, and they must screen on the intake, all the victims on the intake within 24 hours. And then we also must have the MDT, the multi-team displaced staffing, within 2 weeks of that intake. And that's for all suspected and verified victims. So if there's absolutely nothing there when the CPI goes out, then that MDT is not set on the schedule. Again, all verified victims have to be assessed for a safe house, and that happens during MDT staffing as well. And all not what we call not substantiated. So all cases that are verified or have something going on must have a service plan. So we provide a service plan for a suspected victim or a verified victim. And if a child is placed into a safe house or any type of residential treatment program based on that report or their sex trafficking history, they must be assigned a case manager. Again, all case managers must be specialized with that same specialty track of training. And then again, like I said, we have a 6-month follow-up on all verified investigations, regardless if they're in foster care or they're community children. So that's kind of an overview of how our response is laid out.
Okay, and I see a comment asking for a little backtracking on some of the acronyms. Child Protective Investigations, is that correct, Sue, for CPI? The
yes.
investigation that occurs. And the HTST is the Human Trafficking Screening Tool. So it's a tool that was developed in Florida, and we'll talk more about that later, but it's not unlike tools that have been developed and are in use around the country in different kinds of agencies. So thank you, whoever raised that question, and please do keep pushing back when we get jargony. So I'm going to talk us through the characteristics of children broadly and some special subgroups of children. And in doing this, I'm going to refer to allegations. An allegation of human trafficking is what happens when someone, either law enforcement, another mandated reporter, or anyone in the community, calls a child welfare hotline and reports what they believe is human trafficking. And if it meets certain minimal requirements, like it is about a child, the child is in the state, the location of the child is known with some degree of, it's not completely out there somewhere, the child welfare hotline will accept the case for investigation. And then if the instance proves to meet the criteria and the definition for human trafficking, in Florida's case for either sex or labor trafficking, it will be verified as having occurred. But whether verified or not, the child and their families will be receiving services or will be offered services. That's allegations. So there may be multiple allegations over time of human trafficking for any specific child. And most of what I'm going to be talking about is specific children rather than investigated allegations. As we talk about these numbers, I'm going to beg you to remember that these are identified allegations and identified children. And we never we are so far away from knowing that these actually represent the characteristics of human trafficking in the state of Florida, in the real world. So we feel that our numbers are pretty darn good because this is a big data set, but we also want to point out that, you know, the map is not the territory, and even if it's the best map that we have out there. So with that preamble, first thing that we want to point out always is that we know that human trafficking research suggests many shared risk factors between children who experience human trafficking and children who experience other kinds of child abuse and neglect. But we want to point out that only 20% of the children who are with investigated allegations of human trafficking were in the custody of the child welfare system at the time of that allegation. The other big picture thing is that just over 90% of the allegations recorded by DCF and investigated were for sex trafficking rather than labor trafficking. That's still far more attention to labor trafficking than is typically given, but the characteristics of children who have experienced sex trafficking or possibly experienced sex trafficking will dominate the next few slides that we're talking about. So among children with human trafficking allegations, they're far more likely to be female, about 5 and 6 versus 50% compared to other children who experience maltreatment of other kinds, and that includes child neglect, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. Compared to the rest of the child welfare population, children who experience trafficking are meeting an average age of 16 versus 8 years. And even though they may not be in the child welfare system at the time of the trafficking allegation, children who have, are investigated for possible trafficking victimization are far more likely than others in that population to have histories in the child welfare system of prior abuse or neglect. And the bar chart here shows what kinds of allegations these children are more likely to have. So what you see there is neglect is always the most common form of child abuse that is experienced, but the biggest disproportionality is in sexual abuse, where children who have human trafficking allegations are several times more likely to have experienced sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is always something that gets talked about as a risk factor for human trafficking, but I want to plant in your minds that most of these children experienced allegations of sexual abuse and some other forms of abuse, so sexual abuse and physical abuse, sexual abuse and neglect. And research in the broader field really supports that kind of polyvictimization as a particular risk for trafficking experiences. When we looked at the experiences of children with human trafficking allegations within the child welfare system, these are the children who are at the deep end of the child welfare system in every way we looked at. Even our analyses did adjust for child age because, as I just said, children with human trafficking allegations tend to be older than the rest of the population. But even with that adjustment, they are 3 times as likely to have been in out-of-home care, even more likely to have been in group home care rather than family foster care, and far more likely, 13 times more likely, to have run away from foster care. So I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, then respond to 20% of children in, I'm going to respond quickly to these questions that I can see. The 20% of children who are in placement, that means the trafficking allegation was identified while they were in foster care. It's possible that it occurred prior to foster care and was identified for investigation while they were in foster care. So it's not necessarily saying that they were trafficked while they were in foster care. And this is a concern and a bit of a myth that foster care itself or group home experience itself is somehow increasing children's risk for trafficking victimization. We don't have strong numbers there, but there are many, many other possible explanations for why those numbers are traveling together. And Sue responded to the question about average age. Thank you. Anytime you see a statistic about children's average age, stop and ask how old the population was at the time that information was collected. Because if you have a population of 16-year-olds, their average age at entry to trafficking is going to be about 12. If you have a population of adults, the average age is going to be 18. It sort of depends on how old the group is now. Just something you see confusing data about over and over again. So let's talk about children who run away from home. Among young people who are in foster care after the age of 10, 1 in 5, about 19%, will run from care at some point. Doesn't mean if you have 5 children and 5 10-year-olds, one of them's about to run out the door, but over their lifetime history in foster care between ages 10 and 18, 1 in 5 will run away at some point. And many children run away multiple times. 1 in 10 will run 20 times or more. Of the youth who have at least one runaway episode, 7%, 1 in 14, have an identified trafficking allegation, a trafficking allegation that was investigated related to the time that they were on runaway status. And for most of them, it's their first identified allegation of human trafficking. Now, again, there's lots of reasons why that could happen. I mean, children run from care for many reasons. Some of them, the research suggests that a lot of kids run from care because they want to go to their cousin's birthday party. They're looking for, something that they want to do. They want to see their family. But some kids run away to somebody who's going to exploit them, and some kids run away and end up without resources to fall back on, and then they are very much at risk for having to engage in commercial sex in order to just support basic necessities and to survive. So we know for lots of good reasons that runaway episodes are an enormous point of vulnerability for trafficking victimization, and federal policy is even further ahead, is way out ahead of, in a good way here, by mandating that child welfare agencies and others take special attention to children who have run away from foster care. So when I said that many of the children who have trafficking allegations while they're missing from care are identified, that's because DCF is doing a very thorough assessment when the child returns from runaway status, and Sue's going to describe that for us.
Yeah, so when we have a child that goes missing and they've been recovered, then our case managers are required to do what we call a debriefing with that child within 24 hours. And we have a form that they have to complete once they're done with that debriefing. But the purpose of the debriefing is obviously to let the child know that we were concerned about the child while they were missing, but also what happened, what made them want to go, what made them want to run away. And what happened while they were on runaway, how did they survive, how did they eat, who helped them, what social media may be, all the type of information that you would want to know about a child that was missing that would also help you locate them maybe the next time they go missing. But based on that debriefing, you often find out that they were being trafficked, and that would make them call in a report for trafficking as well. And also possibly screen them with the screening tool for trafficking. We're going to talk more about the whole missing child protocol a little bit later, but I just wanted to share that.
Okay. And so we will get to that, but I want to talk us through some of the statistics about labor trafficking of children first. I told you before that nearly 10% of allegations that the state of Florida has investigated for human trafficking have to do with domestic labor trafficking. And this is labor trafficking of children who are in this country at the time. They may be foreign national children, but the data that DCF has compiled suggests that the majority are U.S. citizens or permanent residents. As I also mentioned before, neither of the two big pieces of legislation that mandate child welfare involvement of human trafficking include labor trafficking. They focus on sex trafficking. But labor trafficking is still a crime, and nothing prohibits child welfare agencies from addressing it as part of their response to human trafficking. And in fact, studies among runaway and homeless youth have found that about half of the human trafficking that the young people identify in surveys is labor trafficking. When we compared the characteristics of children with labor trafficking that were identified by DCF to children with sex trafficking allegations, the two populations look very different. So children with labor trafficking allegations, just over half of them were male, compared to 1 in 6 among children with sex trafficking allegations. They're far less likely to have had any current or prior experience with DCF. And they have far lower history in terms of all kinds of prior maltreatment and prior involvement in foster care. So Sue's going to talk about the kinds of settings in which DCF has investigated labor trafficking allegations. And while she's talking, we would both love it if people who have been involved with labor trafficking allegations could enter a few words in the chat box about what state they're from and what kind of labor setting the labor trafficking was associated with. Sue?
Yes, okay. So like Deborah said, about 10% of our reports are for labor trafficking, and we know it's really underreported in our state as well. But we have seen quite a large amount of the victims being U.S. citizens and part of traveling sales crews. And these traveling sales crews aren't going from state to state so much. They're kind of centered. They travel within Florida, and they come back home every night. They bring the kids back home every night. And they're selling like dollar store items out of tubs, plastic tubs. And it's really a bogus charity. They say they're working for a nonprofit organization. They have some great names they've created, like Teens Against Drugs and Alcohol, things like that. But we're finding that they're really being exploited for labor, and they're also being coerced and forced to do things that they don't want to do, and end up also getting involved in crimes and other things while they're out selling things because they're not being picked up when they're supposed to be picked up, and they're just vandalizing things, or they want to eat and they steal something from a convenience store. So we're having a big problem with those type of cases. But we also do see the non-documented child that's been placed with an identified sponsor, allegedly a relative, and they're actually forced to work to pay the rent and pay back their debt. We're seeing those type of cases as well. They're forced to work in fields mostly, sometimes lawn service. Those are more of the non-documented type of cases we see. And also the servitude, a few of those where the child was given to a relative or possibly sold to a relative and then come to the States for a better life, yet they're forced to work and clean the house and babysit children, and often also there's sexual abuse involved with those as well. But we have a really big problem with our traveling sales crews in the central area of Florida because the children tend to be from that area yet the traffickers take them all over the state of Florida, even out of the state of Florida. They follow football games a lot, so we've had children we've had to bring back from Texas. The recent championship in Atlanta, you know, we had a 12-year-old that was held up at gunpoint for the money in his pocket from selling items. So it's a problem that we're trying to tackle, and we're still working on it. Deborah?
Okay. And rounding out the picture of the kinds of industries that Sue's talked about, and in the chat window we're seeing responses in terms of service industries, carnival work, traveling sales crew, construction, restaurants, brothels, and service industries. The bottom right illustration there suggests that another area of labor trafficking is children engaged in coerced illegal activities, including drug sales, but also shoplifting. And that figures very prominently in the research from Runaway Homeless Youth and other research in where young people are coerced into illegal activities at the behest of families, gangs, or even a facilitator who's, you know, their pimp in terms of sex trafficking. So this is an area that we really don't know nearly enough about, and I hope that we're going to be seeing more attention to it within state and federal policy and services.
Deborah, this is Sue. I just want to comment before I go on mute about that as well. We do receive a lot of reports for sex trafficking, but within the narrative, we also are hearing where they were forced to sell drugs or forced to rob people. You know, we are seeing some of that as well, but definitely we need to get them coded more and reported as labor trafficking.
Okay. And we've got a great question in the chat box of how do we differentiate, or do we differentiate between labor exploitation and labor trafficking? And that's a great question because there is a continuum there that may not be easy to clearly demarcate. But as with adults, the distinctions between exploitive conditions for labor in terms of somebody not being paid what they were owed or somebody being threatened is the distinction as to whether the individual has the opportunity to leave the situation, whether they are physically unable to leave or whether they're unable to leave because somebody else is holding their passports or because somebody says that you know, the employer is saying you owe me money for your housing, and somebody is forced to continue working because of that. That's where the line, fuzzy as it may be, between exploitive labor and labor trafficking will get drawn. So I want to move on to under-identification because any article you read about will start off by talking about the extent of trafficking and how it's a growing problem. But the reality is we just don't know. We don't have any good, valid incidence or prevalence numbers for the extent of trafficking. What we know is how trafficking is identified in different situations, but as the slide suggests, that's the tip of an iceberg of unknown size. In Florida, what I talked about was 6,000 unique children out of 1 million who have in the child welfare population. That's 0.06%, less than 1% of all investigated allegations. If you only looked at children over 10, it's about twice that, so 12 in 1,000. But we have a national study of youth in the general population, the Ad Health study, in which 5% of the young people surveyed reported having traded sex for something of value before they were 18 or in their lifetime, and they were 21 at the time. And so, you know, not precisely, depending on their ages at the time, that would be the legal equivalent of having experienced human trafficking. So we know that there's under-identification, even within the Child Welfare Agency, that is far and away doing more to identify human trafficking compared to other states, as far as I know. At RTI, our statisticians have run statistical models looking at the characteristics of children who do have identified trafficking victimization and extrapolating from there using a couple different methodologies. And depending on the method, it suggests that at least 3 times as many more children are victims than are identified, and it could be much more. So clearly there's a long way to go, and on the ground and in practice, the strategy is just to continue child welfare efforts and efforts in other agencies serving children who are at increased risk to identify trafficking. And Sue's going to talk about some specific ways that Florida has worked on that. Sue, you may be muted.
Yes, it took me a minute to get off the mute, sorry. Yeah, well, for one thing, I just want to point out, in 2009, when we added the maltreatment to our abuse hotline, that first year, we only had 43 reports come in. Last year, we had over 2,000 reports come in. So obviously, awareness is huge, right? It's not because we have so much more children within those amount of years that are being trafficked. We just have more awareness, and people are actually identifying it and calling it in. So we have focused on doing awareness and training with our what I would say our usual mandated reporters, which everyone's a mandated reporter, but our school staff, our hospital staff, our first responders, everyone to know when they come in touch or cross or identify a victim or possible victim, that they can make a report to our hotline. But on top of that, we've also have done the specialized training within our system with our case management and our child abuse investigators as well, so they know what they're looking at as well, because they could have had a child on their caseload who had all the signs of being trafficked, but had no idea that that's what it was. So it took a while. Over the years, as you can see, our reports have increased. Our identification has increased as well among the population we served. But awareness is what has helped us increase identification, and using the human trafficking screening tool and being trained appropriately on that, which we're going to talk more about that later as well, has helped us identify more.
Okay, so our goal was to allow plenty of time for questions at the end, and we're going to speed up a little bit, but we wanted to talk through some of the strategies that we do have available, or that the field has available, for the response to human trafficking. And as a researcher, my goal is always to look for absolute certainty, but we know enough to begin responding, and in fact, many communities are responding in child welfare and other systems. In terms of prevention, there are curricula and interventions that are particularly addressing children who are at high risk, who are in child welfare or juvenile justice settings. Interventions with evaluations include My Life, My Choice and Love 146 Not a Number, which has the advantage of also being directed at males as well as females, but we certainly need more male-focused programs. But it's also true that it's not just children in the child welfare system who need to hear this prevention message. So Sue, can you talk a little bit about what Florida is doing in terms of community-focused prevention efforts? And while Sue talks, we'd love to hear any promising or successful prevention strategies that people in the audience want to point to. And please include your state in your response.
Okay, so I think we all know that this is a two-generational problem if we want to do prevention. It's not prevention for the family, for the children, and for the adults as well. And we also have stressed on trying to get prevention within the schools for the students themselves. Some schools in Florida, every district has their own ability to approve curriculums. So some schools have done that. And in most schools, we have done a poster series, which is a 4-set poster series. One is focused on labor trafficking, and the other 3 are sex trafficking, which are targeted for children. The message is for children to read and understand. Of course, we've done training and awareness for the staff on how to respond. but also we've done this little bit of prevention pieces within the schools. And right now in front of legislation, there is a bill that's going to require mandatory training within the healthy the health class in high school. So hopefully that will pass as well. Again, and also another thing that schools are focusing on is the internet safety as well. That's huge to affect the prevention for children to understand how easy it is to be groomed through gaming and through internet and media and social media, et cetera, as well. So we've been working on all of those. Still have a long way to go, but those are some of the things that we've been trying to do.
Okay, and thank you for the people who are entering other responses in the chat box. We will really look forward to examining them later. I want to talk about efforts to improve identification, including screening. This is certainly an area of a lot of focus in child welfare and often in juvenile justice. There are two strategies that are often used together. One are indicator tools like those illustrated on the slide that identify some red flags that should alert providers to the possibility of human trafficking. The other are interview tools that consist of questions asked directly of youth in non-jargon terms and that are very behaviorally specific about the work they do, whether they're paid for their work, whether anybody forces them or threatens them. And these tools, depending on the setting, may be administered to all children, or maybe the interview tool is administered to children where there's a red flag observed, or, as Sue described earlier, whether some form of screening is done at a particular moment, like when a child has returned from a runaway episode. There's lots of great work being done to improve and validate these tools, but we want to stress that the best interview tool in the world is not going to produce good information unless it's being used in a setting where the young person feels comfortable, where they have a relationship that includes trusting the person who's asking these questions, and whether they have a good reason to believe that something good will happen if they acknowledge what they've experienced. So, Sue, do you want to briefly describe, and I'm sorry to be rushing us,
yeah, I know, we're running out of time.
CSD?
Yeah, so the human trafficking screening tool that we developed in 2014, we did it in conjunction with our Department of Juvenile Justice and a few other agencies. We formed a work group, went over all the existing tools at that time, and decided to develop our own in response to, remember, the legislation that ordered us to develop one, because we didn't find one at that time that addressed male and female and addressed labor and sex trafficking. Ours is not perfect. We've learned a lot from it, and we're reevaluating it also now, but it has really made a big difference for us. And I would tell you, when we first piloted it among our child abuse investigators, we chose two areas that had very low verification rate compared to the rest of the state, which didn't make sense because they were large cities. They were very large cities. So as soon as they got training on the tool and started utilizing the tool, their verification rate of cases went up tremendously, where they were at the same as state average or above the state average. It helped them understand more what it was. Of course, the extra training also helps, but also we quickly learned that we had to train them, and as Deborah has already kind of mentioned, it has to be a conversation with the child. Just because it's labeled a tool, it's not a checkbox. It's not something you take with you and you just check off all these questions. It's to guide your conversation. It's something we train them to be familiar with. We ask them not to show it to the child, but it's to inform their conversation. And obviously, you know, they need motivational interviewing skills, and they need to know how to respond to what the child says. They may not get the answers in the order of the tool. You know, it's just supposed to be a conversation. They can go back and look at everything all together on this paper or on their desktop as they fill out the answers to these questions, and it all makes sense to them, and it makes them, you know, understand more what's going on with that child. So that's how we use the tool.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about responses across youth serving systems to Runaway. These include prevention strategies. There are a couple validated prevention strategies that engage young people in identifying the reasons why they might run away from foster care and engages them in a partnership to say, well, what can we do that would help you stay where you're placed? And sometimes often it's something that turns out to be very much within the power of the child welfare system. There are harm reduction strategies that could include making sure that young people who have run before have the information about where a safe shelter might be, and other strategies to do assessment like what Sue described when a young person comes back to say, you know, what have you experienced? Where did you stay when you were away? You know, let's look at what kind of factors that we can address there. And Sue, forgive me, but I'm going to just summarize what I think you would have described much better as the final piece of that, and that's a system response to engaging all kinds of providers, not just in reducing the frequency with which youth run, but increasing the response in terms of reporting runaway youth to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and improving the response that helps recover children from runaway episodes quickly. I want to talk very briefly about opportunities to improve the response for labor trafficking. Prevention strategies include things like the awareness raising that Sue described, incorporating labor trafficking in other prevention programming for young people, but also training community first responders, because they're often, you know, police are often the first people who notice something that just doesn't quite look right when a young person is selling trinkets on the street. And other services that might support children who need extra income because, you know, they're either in response to their family's situation. Services broadly that would reduce labor trafficking might include things like summer jobs program. And Susan is reminding me that we can keep talking, and we will be happy to answer questions online even after we get to the top of the hour, but we know some people need to get off, so we're going to talk a little more quickly here. States are implementing, and this is me talking from our national study, states are implementing coordinated services for young people who are identified as having experienced trafficking. It's a central tenet of these services that they be trauma-informed and including trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Many states are incorporating survivor-led or survivor-staffed services into the supports that they offer for children who are trafficked. Some are working with specialized placement services like residential settings that are very specifically trained and geared up for children who have been trafficked, or even therapeutic foster care, and always with a lot of coordinating among the different services that these children need. Sue, anything quickly that you want to ask, or shall we just keep going here?
No. Well, quickly, I just want to say that, you know, we do have the Safe Home program as well as Safe Foster Homes program, and also a lot of victim and survivor-led services available. We do know that the Safe Foster Home model tends to be more successful with the child, the more one-to-one interaction, and even if the child runs, you know, being available to have the ability to return to the same home and build up that bond with those foster parents has been great. So I just wanted to share that.
Okay. And finally, I just want to talk briefly about the importance that all these services have a very comprehensive focus. Everything we know about trafficked youth suggests that they're most likely to come from profoundly vulnerable settings in which they've been experiencing some form of disadvantage for much of their lives, with few resources that they need to navigate into adulthood. So trafficking victim services can't just address those immediate needs. It's not about rescue and providing some safety and mental health and physical health, although those are, of course, essential, but we also have to be thinking about long-term social relationships, the kind of supports that any young person needs to navigate into adulthood through support for education and employment development. And the evaluations that we, including people like me, do have to assess or look at that holistic perspective. So we both apologize. I apologize in particular for going over time, but I am happy to respond to any questions that people put into the chat box. And as Susan is entering, we will post some additional resources with more complete details on some of the things we've been talking about. But thank you, speaking for both of us, I think.
Yeah. Well, thanks to both of you. I'm so glad that we learned so much today about the research and the practice going on in Florida. So please, folks, go ahead and enter your questions in the chat box. And as I warned you, at the same time, we're going to go ahead and post our exit poll so that those of you who have to leave can give us some quick feedback before you do. But we'll turn to, and if you can see, you can reopen the chat box. Just click on chat. So we'll go ahead and start some of these questions. The first question that I see is, as a practice, do you try to address concerns outside the court? And I'm assuming that must be regarding court-involved youth.
Okay, Sue, take it.
Yeah, this is Sue. Can you be more specific? What do you mean outside the court? We do victim counseling. I'm not sure, what do you mean, if there's no court case?
This might be outside of children who are legally mandated in a dependency court to the child welfare system. So not what you would call community kids.
Are those concerns outside the court?
But Richard, please type it.
Yeah, if he could be, be a little bit more specific so that I know how to answer. We do address community children and dependent children the same as far as services and even placement in safe houses, if that's what you're asking.
Well, while we're waiting for some more questions to come in, I had a question. Oh, I see that is what Richard was asking.
Okay.
Children who are removed from their home.
So children who are removed from their home, concerns outside the court case, I'm sorry, I'm still not sure, but we too try to address all the concerns of the child if it's involved with the dependency case or not.
So Sue, I know that Florida's law, the safe houses are absolutely accessible to young people, even if they're not involved with the child welfare system.
Right. We have to respond. We have to respond to all verified victims the same, regardless if they're dependent involved or not.
So I had a question. Are you all working on some follow-on research already? This has been great information, but what are your next steps?
As it happens, we are in the process of planning a continuation of our work with Florida that we're very happy to have received, in which we're going to be looking at children who are involved in the juvenile justice system and, including those who are involved in both child welfare and the juvenile justice system, and the implementation of the human trafficking screening tool within the juvenile justice setting.
That sounds very interesting. And there's a clarification for a question in the chat box.
Okay. Okay, so Richard, who asked the question about court, raises the question of children being lost once they're placed into the system, and I don't know if that is for national children being lost in the system or rather than foster care. And for children, okay, both children, thank you. I think the experience of, I will speak because I just spent a long time researching this for an article that we've got coming out on labor trafficking. Unaccompanied foreign national children are placed in with sponsors by the Federal Office of Refugee and Resettlement, not by the child welfare system. So the reports about children being lost once they're placed with sponsors are on the responsibility, or that's an issue within ORR. I think within the foster care system, and Sue will definitely speak to this, their children don't get lost.
Right, this is Sue, not at all. We have a very strict protocol on that. And the courts, the dependency judges are very supportive of this, of all of victims of trafficking as well in the dependency court system.
And I know there's several states in which dependency court judges have been real champions of this effort. New Mexico comes to mind. I was just on a panel with Judge Martinez. Sue, can you talk briefly about standardized training for
yes,
child
it is policy. Yeah, I see that question now. So our standardized training, which is an additional 6-hour course initially, is also the outline for it is identified by policy, and then they have to maintain a quarterly training as well to keep up their status, so additional trainings. And they have to be a certified trainer, so there's an approved train-to-trainer course that trainers can be certified by for that. Did I answer? Let me go back up. It's gone down now.
Yeah, you can X out and get rid of the exit poll. National coalitions where tools and programs can be discussed and compared. We meaning RTI, are in the process of planning a study where we will look across try to assemble as many of these tools and do a little content analysis of how similar or different they are. I do not currently know of a resource for comparing those tools, but I think the Federal Center for States or the Child Welfare Information Gateway could be a great resource for finding information. Sue, do you want to ask about or respond to the question about preferred interview method or guidelines? Again, I don't know of national or your big picture references here.
Yeah, I don't know of any national like preferred or anything that's been validated or anything like that. I just know obviously the child has to be comfortable and you have to build up rapport. And you can't force it. So that's kind of, of course you have to be trained in trauma-informed care and motivational interviewing and all those other things you can utilize, but you have to also build up some kind of rapport and respect that child and be non-judgmental.
And I believe there are a couple fact sheets or suggestions on the Child Welfare Information Gateway addressing best practices. I'm also seeing a question now about refugee and immigrant populations coming to Pennsylvania from many different countries and cultural issues and solutions. Before, I don't know, Sue, if you want to add anything to that, but one suggestion I would make is reaching out to the listserv that's operated by HEAL, H-E-A-L. And we can post that, and somebody else has just suggested the Department of Homeland Security Blue campaign. Sue, are you able to, when we post follow-up information, are you able to share the HTST and the debriefing interview?
Yes, and the MDT tool as well, the multi-team disciplinary tool that we have as well. All of them are available on the Florida Centers for Child Welfare website, but I can post them independently with you, Deborah.
Okay. And again, a question about undocumented children. This is, well, what we don't have in our research, and even in the research, the article that's coming out, is a good description of how many children, or what portion of the labor trafficking allegations identified in Florida occur among children from outside the country, because that information is not always available when the investigation begins. But there is a Senate subcommittee report that you can find that lays out this system and the differences among system pretty clearly. And there's a link to one very good article from the Congressional Research Service describing this system, and I will post that link when we add additional resources.
Just to comment a little bit about the refugee immigrant population, undocumented children as well, and what we've encountered in attempting to help them. Obviously, it depends a lot. A lot of the cultures are very closed. They don't want to share anything. But if we have a child that's here alone without any real family and has been placed with a sponsor that does not really have an attachment to, they tend to be welcoming our help and are happy to leave that house and actually go into foster care if it needs to be. It just depends. We also try to find someone who is close to that culture, someone who may be from that country that works within our agency that can go with us to interact with them, to understand a little bit more and make them more comfortable, someone who has a native language that they share. You know, but it is difficult. It depends what's going on, and it depends on their age. We've had children as young as 8 without any adults with them or relatives with them. So it just depends.
Okay. And Sue, there's a question here about how does DCF work to improve recovery of youth who are missing from care rather than in addition to responding to them after they're recovered. And this is something we wanted you to cover. So
yeah.
Here's your
So back in 2002, actually, we developed a very strict protocol on responding to missing children. We actually connected with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children back in 2003, where we directly within our system can hit a button and our report goes to our Florida law enforcement and to the National Center immediately when we complete the report within our system. But we have extensive training on it, on what to look for, how to fill out these reports, and then they have to make weekly efforts to locate the child, and we do extensive training on what kind of efforts they can do. And if a child ends up being missing more than 30 days, they have to do what we call a missing child staffing, and included in that staffing is the law enforcement detective, that whoever is assigned through that agency to that report, if there's anyone assigned, plus the case manager and anyone else that can provide insight to locating that child. And remember, the debriefing forms for your habitual runners, usually the debriefing forms, if you look back at them, has a lot of information that can give you clues to where that child is. So I would like to just share that back in 2003, because I used to do missing children for the state in 2003, we averaged on any one day to have over 7 children missing. Today we average less, 250 or less on any one day missing from the whole state from care. And we also know that they stay missing less. So within 2 days, we're locating most of our youth that go missing. So we have diligence. We make sure that our foster care is privatized, and we call them CBCs, community-based care agencies. Everyone has a position, which is a missing child human trafficking specialist within their group as well, who have to also track and make sure that all of these things are being done by their case managers, the diligence efforts to locate, et cetera. So
that's excellent. So this may be the last question, but I think it's an important one about Florida's reporting to the federal government under the requirements of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act and the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Protecting Families Act. So, so you can respond,
I can respond to that.
I can respond nationally as well.
I mean, we've already been in compliance with that. Like I said, in 2003, we were reporting our missing children up to the National Center as well. We were keeping track on that missing child reporting form. We have a tab if they've been involved in prostitution, et cetera. And we also have within our SACWIS, our data system, if the child is involved as identified victim, et cetera. So we have all that data already available. So we're already kind of in compliance with that before that act ever came out.
Okay. And the question may also have addressed whether been thinking of the requirement that state child welfare agencies report the number of trafficked children to the federal government. The Preventing Sex Trafficking law required states to report that number, and the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act requires states to record information or report information to the federal government through the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System. That process is implementing slowly. There's variability, as we know, in terms of how states are defining and recording. Yes, exactly. So the federal government reporting requirement has been delayed. There's some big questions surrounding that, which makes the data that Florida is collecting all the more valuable. So thank you, Alexis.
All right, it looks like that's it for questions. I want to thank you both again so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. This has been really informative. And folks, I'll remind you that the recording and the slides and the links that we discussed will all be available in the next couple of days. We will send out an email to let you know when that's all been posted. Please do take the exit poll when you leave. Deborah and Sue, any parting comments?
That's it. Thank you for everyone who participated and asked questions, and thank you, Susan, for hosting.
Yes, thank you.
All right, goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.